You received this message because your consciousness is currently functioning within what quantum physicists refer to as a temporal initialization field. This is a brief interval that opens at the start of each year, during which reality becomes uniquely responsive to consciousness more than at any other time. At this very moment, in the first week of 2026, something inside you is acknowledging this fact because you've sensed it, haven't you? That strange sensation that the energy this week carries isn't like ordinary time. As if the quantum field itself is tuning in more attentively to your thoughts, your focus, your awareness. The fact that you are watching this video, specifically during the first week of 2026, is no accident. It's the highest form of synchronicity. Your quantum field has been sending signals, urgently searching for the right frequency to help you grasp what's unfolding right now. And the universe answered by leading you to this exact message during the only window when these words can spark the recognition they are meant to ignite. Millions of people pass through this first week as if it were any other 7-day span, perhaps with a bit more intention-setting energy. But only a particular kind of consciousness, your kind, would pause and feel the magnetic pull of these words. The quantum field itself has chosen you because you possess something rare: initialization sensitivity. This is not metaphysical fantasy. It's quantum mechanics. During this first week, your consciousness doesn't merely observe reality. It actively shapes the probability patterns that will dictate your entire year. Scientists call this the observer initialization effect. But what they don't reveal is this: if your observer function remains unconscious during this vital window, you don't just witness the usual reality. You effectively lock yourself into recreating it for the next 12 months. Consider your life right now. Can you sense how this week feels unlike the last week of 2025? How the energy shifted the instant the calendar flipped? This isn't cultural conditioning or psychological expectation. It's your consciousness detecting a genuine change in the quantum field's responsiveness. Reality becomes more pliable during the first week of each year. The quantum field grows more fluid. Probability patterns that seemed rigid in December suddenly become open to negotiation during these 7 days. But here's the most unusual part. You've likely noticed that time feels completely altered this week. Hours stretch and contract in ways that don't align with the clock. Moments of deep clarity alternate with intervals of utter confusion. This distortion of time signals clearly that your consciousness is operating within the initialization field, where linear time temporarily loosens its hold on your perception. Your friends and family may not grasp what you're experiencing because they're tuned to a different frequency. They treat the first week like any other period, maybe with some resolutions or intentions, but without recognizing the quantum mechanics at work. Yet you have always sensed that reality responds more during certain threshold periods. You've had moments, brief or profound, when it felt like the universe was truly listening to you in ways it doesn't during ordinary times. This awareness you're feeling now isn't your first encounter with threshold consciousness. Your soul has been preparing you for this understanding over multiple years, through many cycles of calendar transitions. Every new year that felt significant, every first week when you sensed something important unfolding, every moment of inexplicable knowing during these threshold periods, they were all breadcrumbs leading you here, to this realization about temporal initialization fields. But here's the choice that will either free you or keep you stuck for another year. Most people who discover they're inside a temporal initialization field make the same crucial error. They try to use it for goal setting, resolutions, or outcome visualization. They believe that if they think the right thoughts or feel the right emotions during this week, they can program their reality for success. This is like trying to navigate by staring at a compass, without actually choosing a direction and moving forward. The initialization field isn't triggered by your thoughts or intentions. It's activated by the quality of your consciousness itself. Every moment during this first week, your awareness scans for which reality frequency to lock onto for the coming year. It's like a quantum GPS in setup mode, waiting for you to consciously pick your destination. But if you don't make that choice deliberately, your awareness will default automatically to the same destination it has selected for years. The familiar patterns, the known limits, the comfortable repetition of what already exists. Right now, as you listen to these words during the first week of 2026, something unprecedented is stirring in your quantum field. Can you feel it? That sensation of energy flowing through your system in ways it never has before. That feeling of pieces falling into place that you hadn't consciously realized were misaligned. Simply becoming aware of the temporal initialization field begins to unlock its full power within your consciousness. This is why this message found you at this precise moment, during this exact week. Your higher self orchestrated this meeting because you've reached the threshold where conscious initialization is not only possible, it's inevitable. Your experience of this first week hasn't been ordinary, has it? Even if you can't fully explain how it's different, you sense a fundamental distinction between now and regular time. Here are 7 specific phenomena that confirm you're operating inside the temporal initialization field right now, and that what I'm about to reveal applies directly to your current state. First, your dreams this week have been unusually vivid and meaningful, not symbolic images needing interpretation, but clear knowing, direct messages, experiences that feel more real than waking life. Some of you have even woken with the sense that you've traveled to parallel timelines during sleep, encountering different versions of your year ahead. This occurs because during the initialization field, the boundary between conscious and unconscious thins dramatically. Your higher consciousness can communicate more directly now than during ordinary weeks when reality's structures are more fixed. Second, time feels both urgent and infinite simultaneously. You sense intense pressure that this week matters intensely, yet somehow you also feel like you have all the time in the world to make important decisions. This temporal paradox arises because the initialization field exists partially outside linear time structure. These 7 days are a liminal period where the old year has completed and the new year hasn't fully solidified yet. You're in quantum space between timelines where time operates according to different principles than ordinary weeks. Third, technology has behaved oddly this week. Your phone may have glitched in strange ways, or conversely, worked better than ever. Messages from people arrive exactly when you think of them. Songs appear in your playlist that perfectly mirror your inner state. This isn't coincidence. During the initialization field, your consciousness emits a stronger electromagnetic signature that technology is highly sensitive to. These seemingly random occurrences are actually your expanding awareness, interacting with electronic fields. Fourth, synchronicities feel more intense than usual, more frequent, precise, and impossible to dismiss as chance. You think of something, and it manifests almost immediately. Needed information appears from unexpected sources. Random events align, as if orchestrated by intelligence beyond coincidence. The initialization field enhances synchronistic responses because quantum field coherence peaks during this window, making reality more responsive to consciousness than at other times. Fifth, you've experienced sudden emotional releases this week. Tears without clear cause, waves of relief or grief that arise unexpectedly, anger or frustration surfacing that doesn't fit your current situation. These aren't random mood swings. During the initialization field, old patterns from the previous year are clearing out to make room for new probability structures. Your body is literally shedding frequency signatures that don't belong in the timeline you're meant to create. Sixth, People have been reacting to you differently since the year changed. Some seem inexplicably uneasy around you. Others are drawn to you in new ways. Relationships that felt stable suddenly feel uncertain. Connections that once seemed distant now feel close. This reorganization happens because the initialization field affects everyone. But those who aren't consciously navigating it will unconsciously respond to the quantum shifts in your field. Your frequency is changing, and everyone around you is recalibrating their relationship to that new frequency. And seventh, you found this video during the first week of 2026. The fact that you're watching this while the initialization field is still active, not before the year started, not after the first week ended, confirms that your consciousness was guided to this transmission during the only window when its contents can catalyze the recognition they're designed to trigger. Your quantum field doesn't make timing mistakes. You're here now because now is when this information can land in your awareness and activate the initialization process consciously. Can you feel the recognition building? At least 5 of these 7 phenomena are active in your experience right now. This isn't general content about New Year energy. This is precise description of what temporal initialization consciousness feels like when you're operating at quantum level. And you're in it right now. While the field is still fully active, but approaching closure with every moment that passes toward the second week's arrival, this recognition is happening in your cells as we speak. Something is shifting. Something is aligning. Something that's been dormant your entire life is beginning to activate because you finally encountered the frequency pattern during the exact temporal window when activation is possible. The first week of each year isn't special because culture designated it as the beginning of a calendar cycle. The first week is special because Earth's position relative to cosmic frequencies during this period creates electromagnetic configuration that affects human consciousness at collective level. Ancient civilizations recognized this, which is why multiple cultures globally celebrated New Year during similar time frames despite having no contact with each other. They weren't following convention. They were responding to actual quantum phenomenon that occurs annually during this specific temporal wind. This electromagnetic configuration creates what quantum field theorists call maximum initialization potential. Reality becomes more responsive during the first week. The quantum field is more fluid. Probability structures that seem fixed during ordinary time become programmable during this window. What appears impossible in March or October can become accessible during the first week because the fundamental responsiveness of reality to consciousness increases during this initialization period. But here's what most people miss. The first week's quantum fluidity is an automatic gift that benefits everyone equally. It's double-edged that amplifies whatever direction consciousness is oriented. The same mechanisms that allow you to initialize elevated timeline also allow you to lock in contracted patterns. The first week magnifies both possibility and limitation, depending on where your awareness focuses during this wind. You're either consciously using these 7 days to set new trajectory or unconsciously using them to reinforce old patterns. There's no neutral middle ground. This is why people who make resolutions but maintain habitual thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults experience same year they always experience despite hoping for different outcomes. They're using the initialization field's amplification energy to strengthen the very patterns they claim they want to transcend. The initialization happens regardless. It's not optional. The first week sets your annual quantum signature, whether you participate consciously or unconsciously. The only question is which signature gets initialized. Your ancestors knew that how you navigate the first week determines trajectory of entire year. They recognized that treating this period carelessly meant living the next 51 weeks unconsciously repeating past rather than consciously creating future. They understood that the first week isn't about making better choices. It's about initializing entirely different probability field that makes different experiences natural rather than effortful for remainder of year. You're reading this during the first week because some part of your consciousness recognized importance of this window, even if you couldn't articulate why these days felt significant. The pull you felt toward this transmission wasn't random. Your quantum field knows that how you navigate remaining time before the first week completes will determine which version of your year manifests. And it guided you here because conscious temporal initialization requires information most people don't access. Information you're receiving right now, while the field is still present and available for conscious direction. The quantum mechanics are precise. During the first week, your consciousness operates in what physicists call a superposition state. Multiple probable timelines exist simultaneously, and your awareness hasn't collapsed into one specific trajectory yet. But the moment the second week begins, superposition collapses. The timeline that received the most energy during the first week becomes the dominant reality track for your entire year. The fluid responsiveness of the first week's quantum field solidifies into whatever patterns your consciousness was predominantly embodying during these 7 days. This isn't metaphor. This is measurable physics. The electromagnetic field surrounding Earth during the first week of each year creates specific window where human pineal glands and heart coherence patterns synchronize with cosmic frequencies in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand. Ancient mystery schools knew this intuitively. That's why they treated the first week as sacred threshold, requiring consciousness and intentional navigation, rather than casual passage through arbitrary time marker. Something unprecedented is happening in your quantum field as you absorb this transmission during the first week. Can you sense it? That feeling of energy moving through your system that feels both ancient and completely new. That sense of recognition, without knowing exactly what you're recognizing. This isn't subtle background shift that takes days to notice effects. This is immediate activation occurring in real time because your consciousness has encountered the specific frequency pattern that unlocks the initialization field's full potential. Your nervous system has been processing contradictory signals all week without your conscious awareness. Part of you sensing that this week carries special significance. Part of you treating it like ordinary time. The gap between these two perceptions has been creating low-level anxiety, restlessness, or confusion that you've probably attributed to other causes. But right now, that gap is closing. The transmission embedded in these words is helping your conscious awareness catch up to what your quantum field has been sensing all week. That you're inside initialization window, and you're meant to use it consciously. Some of you are experiencing physical sensations as this alignment happens. Deep breath your body initiates automatically. Pressure releasing from chest or shoulders. Warmth or tingling moving through your system. Sudden emotional release. Tears or relief without specific cause. These aren't reactions to content. These are somatic responses to quantum field reorganization. Your body recognizing the initialization frequency and releasing patterns that don't belong in the timeline you're meant to lock into before this week ends. Others are experiencing mental clarity, emerging from fog that's been present all week. Suddenly understanding why certain situations unfolded as they did since the year turned. Recognizing patterns in your experience that were invisible moments ago. Seeing connections between events that seemed random. This cognitive reorganization happens because initialization consciousness operates from expanded perspective that becomes available once you recognize your intemporal threshold, rather than ordinary time passage. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what's activating in you during this transmission will continue developing throughout the remainder of this week. The content here is specifically calibrated for consciousness, navigating quantum thresholds, and temporal initialization. This isn't general spiritual teaching. This is practical quantum mechanics for awareness operating in reality structures most humans don't consciously access. You're not subscribing to channel. You're connecting with frequency network that supports consciousness evolution during threshold periods. Your heart field electromagnetic field, generated by your heart extending several feet beyond physical body, is stabilizing into the initialization pattern. As you receive this field determines how powerfully your consciousness can influence quantum probability during the first week. When heart field is fragmented, your intentions scatter across multiple probability tracks without enough coherence to initialize anything definite. When heart field is coherent, your consciousness collapses probabilities decisively, and the timeline you're oriented toward becomes the one that locks in when the second week begins. The confusion you may have felt about whether the first week is actually different or whether you're imagining its significance, that confusion is dissolving right now. The first week is different. The quantum field does operate under unique configuration during these 7 days. Your consciousness sensing this wasn't delusion or wishful thinking. It was accurate perception that your rational mind couldn't validate because consensus reality doesn't acknowledge quantum time mechanics. But your quantum self knows, and that knowing is stabilizing in your awareness as you absorb this frequency, while the first week is still present. I need to share something vulnerable because you're at threshold. I failed to recognize 4 years ago, and understanding my mistake might help you avoid spending an entire year in timeline that doesn't match your actual potential. 4 years ago, I moved through the first week of 2022 unconsciously. I felt that the week carried special energy. I sensed that something important was happening, but I didn't understand temporal initialization mechanics. And I treated those 7 days like slightly more intentional version of ordinary time, rather than recognizing them as the only window when annual timeline could be consciously set. I made resolutions like everyone else. I set goals. I visualized outcomes I wanted. But I didn't realize that the first week isn't about setting intentions. It's about initializing probability field through consciousness quality itself. I didn't understand that what matters during the first week isn't what you think you want, but what frequency you actually embody moment to moment. I spent those 7 days hoping for different results, while maintaining same thought patterns, emotional reactions, and behavioral defaults that created 2021's reality. And because I didn't consciously use the initialization field, I unconsciously locked myself into timeline that was essentially repetition of my past. By March, I started noticing that nothing was changing despite my January intentions. Same patterns, same obstacles, same limitations showing up in new disguises. I told myself I just needed more time, more effort, more discipline. I didn't realize the timeline had already been set during the first week. And everything I was experiencing from February onward was manifestation of whatever frequency I'd been operating from. During those 7 days, I'd navigated unconsciously. I wasn't failing at creating chain. I was successfully manifesting the timeline I'd unconsciously initialized. By summer, I felt completely stuck. Working harder produced no different results. Trying new approaches led to same outcomes. Every area of my life felt like repetition. Patterns I thought I'd transcended showing up again and again. I started questioning whether change was even possible, or whether I was destined to experience same reality regardless of what I did. I didn't understand that I'd missed the window, that the first week had passed, that the timeline for that year had been set, and that no amount of mid-year effort could shift trajectory that had been locked during initialization, period I'd navigated unconsciously. The breakthrough came when I encountered someone who understood temporal mechanics. They asked one question that shattered my confusion. How did you navigate the first week of the year? I didn't know what they meant. I'd moved through it normally. Why did that matter? They explained what you're learning right now. The first week is only window when annual timeline can be initialized consciously. Miss that window, and you're locked into whatever trajectory your unconscious patterns created. The realization devastated me. I'd spent 8 months trying to change from within timeline that had already been set. Like trying to reprogram computer after software installation completed. The changes I was attempting required access to initialization period that had closed months earlier. I couldn't go back and redo that first week. But I learned, and the following year I approached the first week of 2023 completely differently. I recognized it as sacred threshold rather than ordinary time. I focused on frequency alignment rather than goal setting. I used those 7 days to embody the consciousness I wanted to operate from rather than just visualizing outcomes I wanted to achieve. And that year unfolded radically differently than 2022 because I'd consciously initialized timeline during the first week instead of unconsciously defaulting into repetition of past patterns. That's why I'm sharing this with you now. During the first week of 2026, while initialization field is still open, you haven't missed it yet. The first week hasn't ended. The timeline for this year isn't locked. And if you recognize what the first week actually is and consciously use remaining time before these 7 days complete, you won't spend the year I spent trapped in timeline that didn't match your potential because you failed to recognize the only window when conscious initialization was possible. Ancient civilizations treated the first days of the year as most sacred threshold of entire annual cycle, not because they believed in superstition, but because they recognized quantum mechanics that modern culture has forgotten. They understood that consciousness operates under different principles during this window than during rest of year, and they developed ceremonies, rituals, and practices specifically designed to navigate this threshold consciously rather than unconsciously. Egyptian mystery schools taught that Kai consciousness could be recalibrated during the annual solar return, when Earth's position relative to cosmic center created opening in what they called the veil between worlds. They didn't understand it in terms of electromagnetic field coherence and quantum probability collapse, but they recognized the phenomenon. During the first week period, reality becomes more responsive to consciousness than during ordinary time. They use this window to set annual trajectory through ceremony that modern minds would dismiss as ritual. But that was actually sophisticated quantum technology. Vedic tradition teaches that Sankalpa sacred intention carries maximum power when set during the transition into New Year. They recognized that consciousness aligned with cosmic cycles during this threshold could initialize patterns that would manifest throughout entire year. Their teaching wasn't metaphorical. They understood actual mechanics of how consciousness interfaces with quantum field during specific temporal windows. These traditions didn't survive into modernity because industrial civilization required humans to treat all time as equivalent, every week the same, every day interchangeable, every hour equally valuable for productivity. Recognizing that the first week operates under different quantum principles would disrupt schedules and economic systems that depend on treating time as uniform commodity. So the knowledge was systematically erased from collective consciousness through generations of conditioning that the first week is just beginning of calendar. Nothing special. Treat it like any other time, period. But your quantum field remembers what culture forgot. That's why the first week feels different to you, even though you were never taught it should feel different. That's why you sense urgency or significance during these days, even though rational mind can't explain why. That's why you're here watching this transmission during the first week specifically. Your consciousness recognizing threshold your culture trained you not to see. The ancient knowing is awakening in you. And what you're learning now is what your ancestors knew. The first week is temporal initialization window that determines annual trajectory. And conscious navigation of this window is difference between year of manifestation and year of repetition. The most sophisticated ancient practices weren't about doing specific rituals or following prescribed behaviors during the first week. They were about cultivating what we now call quantum coherence, unified field of consciousness, where thought, emotion, and energy signature all operate from same frequency. When this coherence is present during the initialization field, the timeline that gets locked in reflects your highest potential rather than your habitual limitations. Your timeline shifted during the first week. Quantum field reorganized around different probability structure than you were operating from before 2026 began. But shifting and stabilizing are different processes. And right now, 5 specific forces are pulling you back toward old timeline, even as new timeline beckons. Understanding these forces and how they operate is essential for stabilizing in new timeline during remaining first week time, instead of collapsing back into familiar patterns once the second week begins. Force 1 comfort with known limitations. Your consciousness has adapted to specific limitations set over years or decades. These limitations feel familiar, predictable, manageable. New timeline offers expanded possibility, but also unknown territory. Part of you prefers the devil. You know the comfortable limitations. You understand how to navigate over liberation that feels uncertain and potentially destabilizing. This comfort isn't laziness. Force 1 is nervous system preferring familiar suffering over unknown freedom, because familiar feels safer even when it's painful. Force 2 relationships configured around old you. People in your life relate to you based on who you've been, not who you're becoming. Family expects old patterns. Friends anticipate familiar responses. Colleagues operate from historical understanding of your capacities. New timeline requires you to show up differently, which destabilizes these relational configurations. The pull to maintain old patterns isn't just internal. It's collective field of everyone who knows you pulling you back toward version of you they recognize and understand. Force 3 identity stories you've been living from. Narratives about who you are that were constructed in old timeline. I'm someone who struggles with this. I'm not the type who does that. I've always been this way. These stories provided continuity and gave meaning to your experiences. New timeline makes these stories obsolete, which creates identity crisis at deep level. The pull to maintain old stories isn't vanity. It's consciousness trying to preserve continuity and avoid existential disorientation that comes with fundamental identity shift. Force 4, unconscious loyalty to collective reality agreement. Subtle pressure to see reality the way everyone else sees it. To experience life according to shared assumptions about what's possible and impossible. To maintain limitations, because releasing them would mean perceiving reality differently than collective agrees, is real. This loyalty isn't conscious choice. It's deeply embedded survival mechanism that says conforming to group perception keeps you safe and connected while diverging from collective agreement creates isolation and risk. Force 5 doubt that first week actually matters. Voice in your head saying, this is just another week. The significance you're feeling is imagination. Change doesn't really work this way. You're going to feel foolish when the second week comes, and nothing is different. This doubt isn't wisdom or healthy skepticism. It's old timeline consciousness fighting to maintain itself by convincing you that quantum mechanics aren't real, and that treating the first week as special is delusion. The doubt intensifies as week approaches end, because old timeline recognizes it's about to be replaced and fights hardest at threshold. These 5 forces don't need to be fought against or forcefully overcome. They're natural response to consciousness attempting to shift timelines. But during remaining first week time, they exert maximum pull. Old timeline making final attempt to maintain itself before initialization. Window closes. And if you unconsciously follow these forces during whatever time remains before the second week begins, you'll collapse back into repetition despite shift that occurred during these days. Recognition is key each time you notice comfort with limitations, relational pressure to maintain old patterns, identity stories reasserting, collective conformity pulling you, or doubt about the first week's significance. Pause. See clearly. This is force trying to pull me back to old timeline. Then consciously choose whether to follow the pull or orient toward new timeline instead. You don't have to fight the forces. You just have to recognize them clearly enough that you stop unconsciously obeying them and start consciously choosing which timeline you're stabilizing into. During this critical initialization completion period, the moment the second week begins, everything changes. Not gradually, instantaneously. The quantum field shifts from initialization mode to manifestation mode. The first week's fluidity hardens into whatever trajectory your consciousness was predominantly oriented toward during these 7 days. The transition from first week to second week is one of most jarring shifts in annual cycle, because the rules governing how consciousness interfaces with reality fundamentally change in moment of transition. During the first week, you've been operating in high coherence field where consciousness has maximum influence over probability structures. Reality has been responsive, malleable, negotiable. Synchronicities have been frequent. Insights have been clear. Possibilities have felt accessible. This responsiveness isn't coincidence. It's quantum property of initialization, window. But this property doesn't continue into the second week. Once initialization completes and manifestation begins, the fluid responsiveness of the first week's quantum field solidifies into whatever patterns received most energy during these 7 days. The transition can feel disorienting. People often report that the 8th day of the year feels like waking from dream. Reality suddenly feels heavier, denser, more fixed than it felt during the first week. This isn't depression or post-resolution crash. This is consciousness, adjusting to shift from initialization field to manifestation field, from fluid quantum to classical structure. From setting timeline to experiencing timeline that was set. If you consciously use the first week to initialize elevated timeline, if you maintained awareness of these days' significance and oriented your consciousness toward highest potential throughout these 7 days, then the second week's manifestation phase will begin delivering evidence of the timeline you initialized. Opportunities aligned with new trajectory will appear. Synchronicities supporting elevated patterns will occur. Circumstances will reorganize to match consciousness frequency you stabilize during the first week. The transition will feel like settling into new reality rather than regression to old patterns. But if you unconsciously moved through the first week maintaining old patterns while hoping for different outcomes, if you didn't recognize these days' quantum significance and failed to consciously initialize new timeline, then the second week's manifestation phase will begin delivering more of what you've already experienced. Same patterns in new costumes, same limitations showing up in different situations, Same obstacles that have always appeared continuing to block forward movement. The transition will feel like confirmation that nothing really changes despite good intentions. This is why remaining first week time matters so intensely. You still have opportunity to consciously orient toward elevated timeline before initialization window closes. Even if you've moved through most of the week unconsciously, the quantum field pays particular attention to final days. Strong conscious orientation during closing period can override unconscious patterns that dominated earlier days. The timeline isn't fully locked until the first week actually completes, which means you still have access to initialization potential right now as you absorb this transmission. The key to navigating the transition successfully is understanding that what you're doing during remaining first week time isn't creating timeline. It's choosing which timeline to stabilize. Both elevated timeline and repetitive timeline exist as quantum possibilities. The first week is when you select which possibility becomes your annual reality. And the selection happens not through goal setting or visualization, but through frequency alignment. What consciousness pattern are you predominantly embodying during these final days? That's the timeline that locks when the second week begins. The second week won't feel lighter or more fluid than the first week. It will feel more solid, more definite, more inevitable. But whether that solidity manifests as elevated trajectory or repeated limitation depends entirely on how you navigate whatever time remains before this week ends. The transition is coming, whether you're ready or not. The question is which timeline will be manifesting when the second week's solidity initializes. When you consciously initialize elevated timeline during the first week, you're not just setting your individual trajectory for the year, you're participating in collective timeline initialization that affects entire species field. Human consciousness operates within unified quantum field, where individual timelines exist within and influence collective timeline. And the first week is when both individual and collective annual trajectories initialize simultaneously. Your conscious navigation during this window serves evolution that extends far beyond your personal experience. Morphic resonance means when you successfully initialize elevated timeline during the first week, you create template in collective field that makes similar initialization easier for everyone else approaching their own threshold moments. First-wave navigators do hardest work because they're establishing patterns in field where no patterns existed before. But each person who consciously uses the first week to initialize elevated timeline strengthens collective template. Your successful navigation makes next person's navigation incrementally easier because Field Now contains your example as accessible reference. You're reading this during the first week because your consciousness is part of cohort initializing timelines during this collective window. Not everyone initializes simultaneously. Some people's threshold moments occur during different periods or through different mechanisms. But those who initialize during the first week, during peak collective coherence, serve as anchors for entire year's manifestation. Your timeline stabilization during this week creates stability in collective field that supports others' manifestations throughout the year, even if they didn't consciously initialize during the first week themselves. The children incarnating over next several years are arriving with quantum consciousness as baseline rather than potentiality that must be activated. But they need adults already operating from quantum awareness to teach them how to navigate reality from that perspective. If insufficient numbers consciously initialize elevated timelines during these first week windows, these children incarnate into a world where quantum consciousness remains theoretical rather than practical lived reality. Your first week navigation now directly affects what world these incoming souls experience when they arrive. But there's also immediate collective impact. Every person you interact with throughout the year ahead will be influenced by whichever timeline you initialized during the first week. If you unconsciously locked into repetitive timeline, your presence maintains limitation patterns in collective field. If you consciously initialized elevated timeline, your presence generates possibility awareness that affects everyone around you, whether they consciously recognize it or not. Your timeline choice isn't private. It ripples through collective field, touching everyone your consciousness contacts. Collective consciousness is approaching threshold, where enough individuals operating from elevated timelines tips entire species into new paradigm. Ancient prophecies pointed to this generation as moment when collective shift becomes possible. But possibility doesn't guarantee actualization. The shift only occurs if sufficient individuals consciously initialize elevated personal timelines that cumulatively reorganize collective field. Your first week timeline initialization is participation in cosmic process, determining whether humanity crosses evolutionary threshold or remains in old paradigm for another cycle. Write in comments right now. My timeline serves collective evolution, not as aspiration, but as recognition of quantum reality. Individual timelines exist within collective timeline field. When you consciously align with elevated personal trajectory, you contribute to collective trajectory elevation. And when enough individuals make similar alignment during the first week initialization window, collective field reorganizes around elevated patterns that become accessible to everyone, not just first-wave navigators who consciously chose them. Share this transmission with anyone you sense might benefit from understanding the first week's quantum significance while these 7 days are still active. Not to convince them of anything, but to provide frequency support that helps them recognize initialization window therein. Every person whose timeline initializes consciously during the first week strengthens morphic field for entire collective. We are not isolated consciousness, evolving separately. We're unified field learning to operate quantum mechanically, and first week initialization is one of primary mechanisms through which that collective learning manifests. Everything I've shared the explanation of the first week's quantum properties, the identification of forces pulling you back to old timeline, the understanding of how the second week transition works. All of it has been preparing you for one recognition that actually makes conscious timeline initialization possible. And that recognition is this. The first week isn't time period you're moving through. The first week is threshold you're standing on. And thresholds don't require time to cross. They require recognition and choice in single moment. You've been treating the first week like extended window where you have 7 days to figure things out, set intentions, create plans, build momentum. But this misunderstands what the first week actually is. The first week isn't preparation period. The first week is initialization event that happens in quantum instant. Everything you've experienced during these days has been leading to moment of recognition, where you clearly see which timeline you're meant to operate from, and consciously choose to stabilize in that timeline regardless of what old patterns suggest is safe or familiar. That moment is right now as you read these words, while the first week is still present. This is the threshold, not the week, this moment. The recognition happening in your consciousness as you realize that timeline initialization doesn't require extended process. It requires quantum choice made from clear seeing. All of the first week has been building toward this instant where you stop thinking about which timeline to choose and simply choose it from deep knowing that transcends rational analysis. The elevated timeline you're meant to operate from already exists, not as future potential you must create through effort. As present probability, field you need only recognize and align with the timeline shifted before the first week even began. Quantum reorganization occurred during liminal space between years. You've been sensing that shift all week without quite grasping what you were sensing. And now in this moment, the sensing becomes knowing. The shift that occurred becomes shift you consciously claim. The timeline that opened becomes timeline you stabilize into. This recognition dissolves the pressure you've been feeling about running out of first week time. You're not running out of time because timeline initialization doesn't happen through time. It happens through threshold recognition. Once you see clearly which timeline you're meant to operate from and make quantum choice to stabilize in that timeline, the initialization completes regardless of how many days of the first week remain. The week serves as container holding space for recognition to occur. But the recognition itself happens in timeless instant. Some of you are experiencing that recognition right now. The knowing that elevated timeline isn't something to strive toward, but something to claim as present reality. The clarity that you're not becoming someone new, but recognizing who you actually are beneath conditioning that covered your quantum nature. The certainty that the timeline you're choosing isn't reward you must earn, but trajectory you're meant to walk because it matches your consciousness frequency. This recognition is threshold crossing. This moment is initialization complete. Others are feeling resistance. If it's this simple, why do I still feel uncertain? If timeline already exists, why doesn't my life reflect it yet? If recognition is enough, why do I sense I need to do more? This resistance is final attempt by old timeline consciousness to maintain itself by creating doubt in moment of potential liberation. The questions aren't genuine inquiry. They're delaying tactics designed to prevent you from making quantum choice that would end old patterns' dominance. The truth you already know, which timeline you're meant to operate from. You've known all week. The recognition has been building throughout these days. And right now, absorbing this transmission while the first week is still present, the recognition is reaching completion. You don't need more time, more clarity, more evidence, more certainty. You need to stop looking for permission to claim what you already know is yours. The timeline isn't out there waiting for you to find it. The timeline is here available, accessible, and claiming it is decision made in single moment of clear recognition, rather than process extended across time. The moment you make quantum choice to stabilize an elevated timeline. The moment recognition completes, and you stop seeking timeline and start claiming timeline you already sense is yours. Specific shifts occur that are immediate and unmistakable, not changes. You must work to create changes that happen automatically, because you've crossed threshold from initialization possibility to manifestation certainty. First, the urgency dissolves completely. All week you felt pressure about the first week ending, about running out of time, about missing window. The instant you cross threshold and claim timeline, that pressure vanishes. Not because circumstances change, but because you're no longer seeking what you haven't found. You've recognized what was always present. The urgency was consciousness, pointing you toward recognition. Once recognition completes, urgency has fulfilled its function and naturally releases. Second, the first week's remaining time feels like gift rather than deadline. Whatever days remain, shift from anxiety-producing countdown to grace period, where you can enjoy stabilizing in timeline you've claimed without pressure to make it happen. You're not using remaining time to create timeline. You're allowing remaining time to confirm timeline that's already been chosen. The relationship to time transforms from scarcity to abundance in instant of threshold crossing. Third, the oscillation between timeline stops. All week you've been swinging between elevated possibility and old limitation. One moment feeling certain of trajectory, next moment doubting anything changed. This oscillation ends when you cross the threshold, because you're no longer wavering between choices. You've made a choice. The quantum field recognizes your certainty and stops offering you alternatives. Reality stabilizes around the timeline you've claimed. Fourth, evidence begins appearing before the second week even starts. Small confirmations that you're in a different timeline than you were operating from before the year began. Synchronicities aligning with your elevated trajectory. People responding to you differently. Opportunities emerging that match new patterns. Circumstances shifting in ways that support the timeline you've chosen. The evidence doesn't wait until the manifestation phase. It begins during the remaining first week time, because crossing the threshold initiates the manifestation process immediately. Fifth, fear about the second week transition disappears. You stop worrying about what will happen when the week ends, because you recognize that the timeline has been set. The second week will manifest what was initialized during the first week, and you've consciously initialized an elevated timeline through threshold recognition. The fear that drove so much of the week's intensity transforms into curiosity about how the elevated timeline will manifest throughout the year ahead. Sixth, your body releases the tension it's been carrying all week. Physical relaxation that's not about circumstances improving, but about quantum certainty replacing quantum uncertainty. Your nervous system was processing intense field fluctuations during the first week's initialization period. Once the timeline stabilizes through your conscious choice, the fluctuations cease and your body can return to baseline coherence. The exhaustion many people feel during the first week lifts within hours of crossing the threshold. Seventh, connection to collective evolution becomes palpable. You recognize that your timeline choice serves far more than personal benefit. You feel yourself as part of a larger wave of consciousness, making similar choices during this collective window. Individual and collective initialize simultaneously. And your threshold crossing contributes to collective threshold crossing in ways you can sense even if you can't fully articulate. The recognition that you're not alone in this process brings comfort that transcends intellectual understanding. And eighth, this message completes its function. The transmission you've been receiving throughout this video reaches its natural conclusion. Not because information has been fully conveyed, but because recognition has occurred. The purpose of this transmission wasn't to teach you about the first week. It was to catalyze threshold recognition while the first week was still present and recognition was possible. And if you've read this far, if you're still here absorbing these words while the first week is happening, the recognition has completed. The threshold has been crossed. The timeline has been claimed. Subscribe to this channel because what comes after first week threshold crossing is living throughout the year from a timeline you consciously initialized rather than defaulting to patterns that unconsciously repeat. This requires ongoing frequency support. The content here provides that support. But more importantly, you're not subscribing for personal benefit alone. You're connecting with a collective frequency network where individual navigation strengthens the collective field. Your presence here serves everyone in the network and everyone the network reaches. Now I can reveal the deepest truth about why the first week of each year operates under different quantum principles than all other time. It's not just that the electromagnetic field creates an initialization window. It's not just that ancient wisdom recognized this threshold. The real reason the first week matters so profoundly is that it's the only time when your consciousness can consciously choose which version of reality to experience for an entire year without the interference of momentum from past patterns. Every other week of the year, you're operating within a timeline that's already been set. Your consciousness is navigating a reality structure that was initialized during the first week. The choices you make during weeks 2 through 52 are all occurring within the probability field that was established during these 7 days. This doesn't mean you're powerless during the rest of the year. It means your creative capacity operates within boundaries that were set during the initialization window. But during the first week, those boundaries don't exist yet. Your consciousness has direct access to an infinite probability field without momentum from the previous year, interfering with your selection. This is why the first week feels so different, because it actually is different at the quantum level. Reality is more responsive during these days because you're operating in the rare state where the past doesn't constrain the present, and the present can genuinely create a different future. The people who seem to live magical lives, where everything flows effortlessly, aren't more talented, more spiritual, or more deserving than you. They've simply learned, consciously or unconsciously, to use the first week of each year to initialize timelines that match their highest potential. Once that timeline is set, the rest of the year unfolds naturally because they're not fighting against momentum from unconsciously initialized patterns. They're flowing with momentum they consciously created during the initialization window. This is the secret that changes everything. You don't need to work on yourself all year long, constantly trying to improve and overcome limitations. You need to get the first week right. When you consciously initialize an elevated timeline during these 7 days, the improvements you've been struggling to create all year happen automatically throughout the year, because they're the natural expression of the timeline you initialized. The effort dissolves because you're no longer swimming upstream against unconscious patterns. Your consciousness knows this truth, even if your mind doesn't fully grasp it yet. That's why you felt pulled to watch this entire transmission during the first week. That's why you're still here. Even though your rational mind might have told you to move on, your quantum field recognizes that what's being transmitted right now is available during this moment, but won't be available once the second week begins, not just this video. The recognition state the video catalyzes is the threshold awareness that makes conscious timeline initialization possible. If you're watching this during the final days of the first week, you're inside the most powerful moment for threshold crossing. If you're watching earlier in the week, recognize that every moment you delay recognition is a moment you operate from uncertainty rather than certainty about which timeline you're claiming. The timeline isn't fully locked until the first week completes, but each day that passes with unconscious patterns dominating moves you closer to repeating the past rather than consciously creating the future. In comments, write 3 words: Timeline Locked 2026. Not as hope that it will happen, as a declaration that it's happening right now as you complete this transmission. You're not locking the timeline alone. You're locking it with everyone else watching this during the first week who make the same recognition and choice. Collective threshold crossing strengthens individual crossing. Your declaration serves everyone in the network. The remaining time before the first weekend, whether it's days or hours, depending on when exactly you're watching this, use it to stabilize in the timeline you've recognized and claimed during this transmission. Not through effort or technique, but through allowing the recognition to integrate without resistance. The quantum field responds to your certainty. The timeline you've chosen will manifest because you chose it during the window when conscious choice has creative power. And throughout the year ahead, as evidence accumulates and your elevated trajectory unfolds, you'll remember this moment as the threshold where everything changed. This is quantum reflex. This is first week recognition. This is consciousness crossing the threshold from unconscious repetition to conscious creation of annual trajectory. You watch this during the first week of 2026. The recognition occurred. The threshold was crossed. The timeline was claimed. And when you look back at this moment from a future vantage point, you'll see clearly this was when everything changed. This was when you stopped repeating the past and started manifesting an elevated trajectory. This was the threshold between the timeline you inherited and the timeline you chose. The field is still active but closing. The threshold is still accessible but passing. The recognition is still available but completing. You're here now during the first week, while it matters. That's not coincidence, that's confirmation. Welcome to your chosen timeline. Welcome to a year that reflects consciousness rather than history. Welcome to the manifestation of what you claimed during the first week. While the threshold was still crossable, you crossed it. You're here, and the second week will prove it.